So how did the McClellan Saddle actually stack up and fare in the field? And what did troopers really like about it versus what did they hate about that iconic saddle? This week on the 11th OVC, part 2 on the McClellan Saddle. So if you haven't already watched part 1 on McClellan Saddle, we introduced an immensely valuable book called Lessons of a Decade, written by a volunteer cavalryman. In it, he states that there are basically no excuses or no excuse at all for sore-backed horses who use the McClellan Saddle. In this book, which goes over all the lessons learned from the war from a cavalry perspective, he continues to say the following.
With the McClellan Saddle, there is very little excuse for sore backs. This saddle, if the requisite care is taken in its use, is one of the best in the world, after the Mexican and Texan. If the blankets are kept smooth and the load on the saddle carefully adjusted so as not to chafe, there need be no sore backs with this saddle.
However, he continues to say,
Should one commence, however, there is nothing in the world to cure it like plenty of warm water and Castile soap.
So based on that perspective, and of course as many modern riders may know, saddle sores are very hard to fully heal and almost always come back if not overly cared for and protected for. The veteran cavalry officer writing this book continues by stating the following.
Cleanliness is next to godliness in wounds. I have found that a piece of coarse gunny bagging laid under the blankets will generally effect a cure in sore backs, even while marching. The remedy is well known among the old regular cavalry on the plains, and I have been surprised at its efficacy. The reason would seem to be that it keeps the harsh woolen fibers of the blanket from aggravating the old sore and allows it to heal.
Now I find this little gem of period horse care very interesting. He mentions this trick of using coarse gunny bagging as if every veteran trooper knew this. I must admit I am pretty ignorant when it comes to period fabric, but he compares the gunny bagging, even the coarse gunny bagging, as smoother or softer than the coarse fibers of the wool saddle blanket. All I can think of is gunny sacks or the burlap tap sacks that we're talking about today, and those fibers definitely seem significantly more coarse than that of the woolen cavalry blankets. Either way, this is an interesting find on how they cared for sore backs. Later, he describes how an entire regiment can be made combat ineffective and blames poor saddling. He states the following.
On good saddling and packing depends all the efficiency of a cavalry force. Your men may be well armed, splendid swordsmen, and dead shots. Their horses may start on the campaign full of life and vigor, but if the saddling and packing are bad, sore backs will soon dismount all of your cavalry and render them useless. During the Crimean War, Captain George McClellan was sent to Europe to inspect and report on cavalry and infantry weapons, accoutrements, and organization. It is a significant fact that excellent organizer could find nothing in all Europe, after due examination, worthy to compare as a cavalry saddle with our own Mexican or Texan tree.
He continues in saying that,
The McClellan Saddle, which is a modification of the Texan saddle, is far better than any in use in Europe. This Mexican saddle tree is the fruit of the experience of centuries. It is the offspring of the Turkish and Arab saddle, very slightly modified. It came into use among the people in whose country the horse took his rise, and it is, in all its modifications, a miracle of comfort and security to the rider. The only objection to it is its weight, a defect by no means remedied in the McClellan saddle.
and it is right here that we get an introductory glimpse of the author's first complaint of the McClellan Saddle, that he thinks there's too much unnecessary weight on the tree due to excess leather. I love this author because he holds nothing back and describes his complaint further by saying,
"There is far too much toggery on this saddle. The flaps, the sweat leathers, the saddlebags are all useless dead weight. As for the saddlebags, they are about as useless and foolish an appendage as I ever saw. Again and again I have seen them thrown away by men whose practical experience had taught them, and the whole reason is that they are too small to hold anything."
And again, I love how he holds nothing back by talking about the saddlebags. He said what we all have been thinking as soon as any one of us had to pack our saddle for the first campaign that we went on. Who in the world designed these saddlebags? And especially compare them to the later bags adopted by the U.S. cavalry. When I first read this, I was happy to realize that the original cast had the same complaints that we do today about the worthlessness of the standard issue saddlebags. However, his solution is kind of interesting.
Take them away and give 2 light, simple canvas bags of twice or 3 times their size, and you give a man somewhere to put his food. The prime trouble with all military saddles is the want of room for provisions and forage, whereas that is all they ought to be made to carry.
But his rant continues to go on to give some significant insight to the average behavior of a trooper while on campaign during the war. He states,
"A man wants no overcoat in summer campaigns. By universal consent it is thrown away before many days out, at the risk of wanting another. I never knew this to fail. All the weight a man carries, besides rations and forage, is himself and arms, 1 blanket, a piece of shelter tent or poncho, a shirt, drawers and socks, a towel, comb and piece of soap. The sleeping blanket and tent are put under the saddle by all old soldiers, and prevent sore backs instead of making them. But forage and food form the weight. As it stands, the men carry them the best way they know how. All the government gives them is 1 haversack. This ought to be changed. 2 good-sized canvas saddlebags with a girth in connection would hold 8 to 10 days' provisions with ease. The girth would keep them down to the horse's sides and save horse and rider from the flapping of his present load. Moreover, a cavalry soldier on his first day's march would no longer resemble a trussed turkey, incapable of motion, and could mount and dismount as easily as he does now with light saddles."
And I love the end of his statement there that he says that troopers are like trussed turkeys and capable of movement. Many of us can relate to that. The first time we mounted with all our accoutrements, weapons, and more importantly, our haversacks and canteens, and made it really difficult to actually get mounted and still get, not look like a cluster or mounting circus on our horse. I know practicing with our saber belt and carbine, no issue. Throw the canteen on, not really an issue. For some reason, as soon as you put all your bed rolls and even your greatcoat in the wintertime and combine that with your loaded down haversack on your person, mounting becomes significantly more difficult and, like he said, makes you like a trussed turkey and capable of movement. However, what's interesting is that one paragraph, in addition to all that I've already said, he states many interesting facts. Number 1, he mentions not having an overcoat in the summer as a foregone conclusion. In fact, I think he says all of it. This can be reconfirmed by the countless letters of both infantry and cavalry either mailing their overcoats home or giving them back to the quartermaster department until winter returns. Secondly, he mentions all, quote unquote, the items that a cavalry trooper actually had, and given the detail down to the comb, you would assume, or one could assume, that the list is pretty comprehensive. He mentions rations, arms, forage, of course, 1 blanket, a tent or poncho, and notice he says or, not and, a shirt and drawers and socks, a towel, comb, and a bar of soap. I find that list kind of interesting, mainly because in previous videos, when we talk about heavy campaigning or packing heavy for a campaign, we talk about, of course, the picket pin, the lariat, and having a blanket, probably maybe, 1 saddle blanket, 2 saddle blankets maybe, along with a sleeping blanket and a poncho, in addition to all the other accoutrements and stuff like that. Arguably that's on the significantly heavy side. And of course, from Lessons of a Decade, this is written, again, more than 10 years after the war, toward the end of the war, especially later on in the book, he talks about Sheridan's campaign in '65, in which the guys really traveled really light, and this makes up for that. Third, in that paragraph, he also mentions that experienced troopers place their sleeping blankets and their tent half or shelter half under the saddle as an additional protection from sores. And again, this is something through experiential archaeology or experimental archaeology that we learn pretty quick, is that why not, especially instead of making your bedroll gigantic, instead of doing that, why not put underneath the saddle, creating more cushion, or at least more distribution along the saddle bars. So the fourth and the last thing that he mentions is what is most interesting. And going with the theme that the standard issue cavalry saddlebags are too small, his solution is to have a bag 2 to 3 times larger that could carry 8 to 10 days rations with ease, is what he says. This supports the evolution of thinking throughout the war, especially of the time in which leaders of federal armies realized that in order to operate effective campaigns, your soldiers just can't have 2 to 3 to 4 days rations. They must be able to press the enemy on a continual basis and must have more rations than the army it kind of started with early on in the war, along with those 2 to 3 to 4 days rations. To support this evidence, if you haven't seen the video of Hooker's famous flying column done by our friends over at the Civil War Digital Digest, we recommend clicking on this card above and watching that, as it supports the idea that leaders throughout the war were realizing the need to figure out how soldiers, or the army in general, could carry more rations for more effective and pressing campaigns. And lastly is a weird thought regarding the author's suggestion of a light girth to secure the larger saddlebags down to prevent the flapping. I find that kind of maybe weird or difficult, as it would lay right across their loin area. Again, talking about the saddle placement here, especially talking about our episode number 1, hopefully you've seen that. If we have saddlebags toward here with a kind of he said a light girth around there, that would go right underneath the same place where they place straps in today's rodeo to make the horses buck. Or maybe I'm wrong, I don't understand what they're kind of saying, or maybe wrong in interpreting exactly where this strap would go. What do you think on his explanation on having large saddlebags with a strap underneath as a light girth to hold them from flapping down? Would it go right underneath the flank here, or do you think it'd be tied over to the saddle somehow, or something like that? Tell me what you think.
The bare McClellan tree is quite light and convenient. It's the leathern toggery that weighs it down. The same bare tree is immensely improved in appearance by a brass rim on pommel and cantle. This also preserves the edge of the cover from wearing out. A McClellan saddle always goes first at the edge of the cantle, and once the rawhide cover is gone, the saddle soon racks to pieces.
And from our own experience and experimental archaeology, I can definitely agree that the rawhide always seems to split easily. However, I would have guessed, at least my own anecdotal experience, that the pommel rather than the cantle splits first. But either way, it doesn't matter. His observation is reflected mostly in our own experience today.
The Texan saddle, which strongly resembles the Mexican, would be better than the McClellan for troops. There are no buckles anywhere upon it. Instead of straps, leathern thongs are used to tie things to pommel and cantle. The broad, flat horn in front is quite a convenience for many purposes, especially to go to sleep on in long night marches. The girth fastens with 2 rings and a long strap between, being secured with an easy slip knot.
And thus is born another convert to Western saddles. While I have some bias, of course, as I was born and raised in the West, first on a Western saddle, I was quite surprised by what I considered the impractical use of English saddles when I finally spent some time on them. Of course, maybe for a shorter period of time, guess relatively speaking to my Western side of things. My first thought, however, was it was comfortable, light. I loved it in all regards, honestly. I liked how it made you sit. It definitely encourages better horsemanship, I think. But the problem is, I felt, especially my first thought, was there seemed to be no real practical use outside of an arena or even a short afternoon ride. I didn't understand where you tied the raincoat or tied your canteen, food for an overnight camping trip with your family. And thus, the author of this period book also saw the benefit of the horn and even the leather ties on the standard Texan or Mexican style saddles, because he goes on to say,
But the Mexican form of girth has one disadvantage. Starting from a triangle of leather, which embraces pommel and cantle, it has a tendency to press on the ends of the saddle and produce sore backs. If, instead of this, a surcingle were used, passing over the middle of the saddle, but fastening like the girth with 2 rings, it would be far preferable. The ring fastening has this great advantage. You can girth any horse with it, no matter how he swells out. He cannot resist. Every turn of the strap through the ring doubles your strength like a pulley. The surcingle is far preferable to the girth as a mode of securing a saddle. It is so used by the gauchos all over South America.
It is here that he really starts picking apart the design of the commonly used Mexican or even Texan style saddles as compared to the McClellan. While he likes the fastening rings on the Texan saddles, that as far as cinching it up, versus the buckle on the standard issue surcingle, he feels that the overall mechanics of the surcingle is superior to the V girth used in comparison saddles. But he has only warmed up, and on this next set of statements, he rips the ordnance department up and down, or the approval committee, whoever approved the McClellan saddle, because he goes on with both barrels by stating,
"One thing about the McClellan saddle, as issued, is radically bad. It has no breast strap, but it has a crupper. This ought to be reversed. It may be with mules, who have no withers, but in 9 horses out of 10, outside of Indian ponies, the fault lies the other way. In active service, the men universally threw away their cruppers in our war, and many who had slim-bellied horses were forced to buy breast straps, by hook or by crook. Many used their surcingles for the purpose, but had to give it up. A breast strap to a cavalry horse is almost an indispensable necessity. In ascending hills, his load is almost sure to slip back, and much botheration ensues. With a breast strap, the girth can be loosened and the horse much eased. Care must be taken to avoid losing the blankets in this case. More than 50 times I have seen the saddle blanket under a carelessly put-on saddle slide slowly back till it gently dropped over the croup, the rider being quite unconscious of his loss till warned of it by others. This is most apt to occur with slim-bellied horses. The blanket should be secured to the saddle in such cases."
It's interesting he says this because in my own experience, I must agree, when going uphill, the saddle really has nothing preventing it from sliding back, while if well fitted, the saddle should be stopped by the withers of the horse when going down hills. He then continues to pick apart the saddle piece by piece by choosing the standard issue stirrups as his next victim.
The stirrups of the McClellan saddle are good and bad. They have good points, but sadly need improvement. The intention of the hood is excellent. It is to keep the foot from slipping through the stirrup, as well as to protect it from bushes, etc. In practice, a man is very apt to get his foot stuck fast between the stirrup and the hood, and to find it worse than the open one for that reason. This part of the objection is easily remedied. A broad strap of leather, nailed across the interval from the bottom of the stirrup to the bottom of the hood, at once removes all the inconvenience. It ought certainly to be done in future in all cases. The second objection is much more serious. It lies in the material of the stirrup, wood. Wood exposed to rain, wind, and weather soon rots, especially around rusty iron bolts. Twice has it happened to the author to have a wooden stirrup break down under him, once causing a heavy fall, and he also stated that he has seen the same thing happen to others so often that he at one time took a prejudice against it, and used the open iron stirrup as safer. But there is no denying that the open iron stirrup gives nothing like so firm a seat as the hooded wooden one. The necessity of pressing upon it in order to keep your feet from slipping forward deranges the seat, whereas in the hooded stirrup the foot hangs as easily as when riding bareback. I have come to the conclusion that a light iron stirrup, hooded, is better than either, and the wonder is that it has not been issued. It would be cheaper in the end, as it would last.
So as he finishes his statements, and of course as the author calms down a bit after describing his irritation of the standard issue stirrups, it is a great indication of how much these men use their saddles. I honestly have had my stirrup leathers break, but I honestly haven't had my stirrups break. The sheer time in the saddle and abuse in the rain and the mud when off the horse and in camp that men in the saddles were exposed to pales in comparison to the event and even frequent riding that I do today. Again, for 4 years, it was their entire life.
The McClellan saddle is a very poor one as far as lasting goes. 2 years knocks all the glory out of it, and there are so many useless little bits of toggery about it, which are constantly getting lost or broken, that it is a wonder it's held its ground so long. But, as in the case of Colt's revolver, a single excellence has counterbalanced its many defects. It is comfortable to ride in, and if it fits the horse any way near, it never gives a sore back. Take it all in all, it is the best military saddle yet in use. The Texan is still better in its way, But still, strip the McClellan saddle to the bare tree, use a leathern surcingle with a ring and strap girth and a breast strap, throw a pair of useful saddlebags across the seat, and girth them a little in the rear, and you have as good a cavalry saddle as a man need wish for. Put a long grain bag behind, and all is complete.
And with that, this experienced cavalry officer ends his rant on the McClellan saddle. What are your thoughts? Comment below on exactly what you think he mentioned, or maybe he forgot something. Do you think he forgot something, or do you think he hit spot on the assessment of the standard issue 59 McClellan saddle issued to Union troops during the American Civil War? Thank you for watching episode 2 or part 2 of the McClellan saddle. Please continue to follow us, like us on Facebook. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and until we see you in the field again, ride hard.